Welcome to a brand new episode of the Michele Tafoya podcast. Jake Bequette is my guest. When you see his name, you'd think it was Bequette, but it's pronounced Beckett. I'll ask him why that is. You may recognize him because he has a Super Bowl ring with the Patriots, even though he didn't play all that much, but he was a defensive end. He was also a United States Army infantry officer. He served in Iraq. He ran for office out of the state of Arkansas. He is a very interesting young man. He was a college football All-American. And I think he's someone you're going to see a lot of in the future. He's got some very interesting impressions of the world, having traveled it broadly, and very interesting perspectives on sports, the military, America, women's sports, the Supreme Court. It goes on and on. He's an interesting guy. Stay tuned for Jake Bequette.
Welcome to the Michele Tafoya podcast.
Jake, welcome. It's great to see you again. One of the things that I noticed right away about your name, and people mispronounce it all the time. They want to say Jake Bequette, but it's Beckett. How did that happen?
That's a great question. You can blame my ancestors who came over from France with that name. I'm sure they had the opportunity to anglicize it, to change it from. So apparently Beckett is a pretty common name in France. It was anglicized by some to Ckett. But I guess that's where I get my stubbornness from. We just went with Beckett with the original spelling, and it confuses everyone. But hey, it's a good conversation starter.
There you go. So now we know your ancestors came from France. And of course, Jake, just a very, very très François. I don't even know if I said that right, but very French name. No, I know it's short for a bunch of stuff, but I wanted to get that out of the way because I've seen people mispronounce it. And I remember hearing it as Beckett and thinking, wow, it doesn't look like Beckett, but there you go. Tafoya gets mispronounced all the time too. You have such an interesting background. And I want to start with the moment that you ran, not moment, but the time that you ran for Senate. What drove you, Jake, after being a pro football player, serving in the military to run for office?
Yeah, well, I was just coming out of the military in early 2021. And obviously that was right after all the events of 2020, the pandemic, the lockdowns, the riots. I mean, that really was a turning point in our country in a lot of ways. It really affected so many things in our culture. And in my mind, it just showed a real breach between a lot of the established restrictions on government. I mean, just the way they were able to lock everyone down and keep everyone in their homes and open certain businesses, close certain businesses. So that was a big driving motivation for me. I always wanted to serve. That's part of the reason why I joined the military. And then I saw an opportunity to serve in political office and run. And, in Arkansas, it's a small state. There's not a lot of open seats in Congress. So you either have to wait your turn or try to knock the door down. I chose for the latter. We were unsuccessful, but, ultimately it was a great experience and got to meet some amazing people, had a great team around me. And, I have no regrets. So we'll see what happens in the future. But that was my primary motivation was really what happened in the country, what I saw in the military, leading into early 2021. And that was really my decision point.
Your time in the military is fascinating to me as well, because this comes after you were part of another team, which was the New England Patriots. You have a Super Bowl ring, as I mentioned in the intro. You go from one team to entering another. The military is quite different, however, but some people look at the military today and wonder if it's on the right track. We're losing recruits in certain branches. There are, these accusations of it becoming a little too woke, for lack of a better term. What did you see, Jake?
I think those concerns are justified. You mentioned the recruiting crisis that's happening right now. That's undeniable. A lot of guys that I serve with, have either done a stint in military recruiting or are in it now, and they say it's even worse than what's reported. Really, what you're seeing is the backbone of the military are multi-generational military and veteran families. I did not come from one. I'm really the first one in my immediate family to serve. But I would say that most of the military are these second, third, fourth generation military families. That's just what they do. But what we're seeing now, and this is a pretty recent development, is you're seeing a lot of these multi-generational families. The newest generations are not really wanting to go in. In a lot of cases, that they're being discouraged from joining by their fathers or their grandfathers who served, and are seeing what's happening inside the force right now. And you mentioned a lot of the political, cultural changes. The military, ultimately, it's an arm of the government. It's a political institution. It's not supposed to be, but the reality of it is that it is. And so it might be able to resist some of the most wild left-wing transformations that the rest of the country has undergone, but it can't resist all of them. And so I just think what you're seeing is a lot of these just backbone military families are deciding to do other things, and that has very serious ramifications for our country's national security, the culture of the military, and just the short to medium term future of our national defense.
I often think, is the toothpaste out of the tube, and there's no going back? And I wonder with the military, because it is a unique structural entity. Can it? You said it can't resist all of the left-wing nuttiness that we're seeing in the world, but is there a way it can say, you know what? This is the military. We're responsible for national security. We cannot have this stuff infect our troops. And when I say infect, I kind of mean that in the literal sense. It's as though, like you said, it's having an impact. It's changing the nature of the military. Is that something that can be turned around?
I'm not sure if it can be reversed. If I were to give an optimistic view of it, I would say, well, I mean, it is true that really there's two militaries. So just kind of bear with me on this. There's kind of the normal forces, and that's there's millions of military personnel. They're what we call support. People who are not really in combat roles, and then you have the other part of the military, which are the real trigger pullers. And at the top of that section of the military, you have the elite of the elite. The people who you think of the special operations forces, those under SOCOM. You think about Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Green Berets, the Air Force PJs. People who are really at the tip of the spear. I will say that those areas of the military are somewhat cordoned off from the wokeness, just because it's so hard to make it through the training, to become one of those elite warriors, that there's really no room for that kind of political nonsense. So there's kind of an element of self-selection, and then there's an element of just weeding out through the actual training itself. So I will say that the good news is that it's almost impossible for some of the worst elements of our culture to drift in to those segments of the military. But unfortunately, the government and the culture are coming after them in other ways. We saw with the vaccines and the mandates that happened. We lost a lot of our most elite warriors in the military because of those mandates. The government now, the DoD is trying to cover their tracks and allow people to be formally discharged for different reasons other than being drummed out for refusing to take the vaccine. So it is it's very troubling. But I will give a word of optimism to say that there's still some incredibly faithful and talented and patriotic people in uniform. It's just typically it's a very small percentage right at the very top, right at the very tip of the spear, the elite. Where you see a lot of the politics and the social and cultural changes, that's really in the support and the millions of other troops who are there in supporting roles.
Okay. Well, that honestly does make me feel a little bit better. What you've seen lately in the wake of October 7th and our stations around the world, particularly in the Middle East, these drone attacks, various attacks on our bases. And a very tepid response, Jake. A lot of people are very bothered by this, that we are not showing that kind of strength that begets peace, strength that tells our adversaries back off. How much can you say in your position about what you're seeing and what you think should be happening?
Well, I think you're exactly right, and we've talked about it on the air, on the show that we did on Fox News a while ago. What we're seeing from this current administration, from the Biden administration, they do project weakness internationally. I was deployed to Iraq in 2019, under the prior administration, under President Trump, and this isn't political. This is just objectively true. We were right there, in a pretty hot area in northeastern Iraq and the Kurdistan, Mosul area, and we were very, we were close to a lot of people who wanted to do us harm. But there was no doubt in our mind that, if the worst were to happen to us or to one of my troops, one of my fellow soldiers, that there would be swift retribution. Because, whatever you want to say about President Trump, our enemies knew that he meant business. And he proved that time and again, during his time in office. And, we've seen, a bit of a change, with Joe Biden, with the way the Afghanistan withdrawal went down. You mentioned these unresponded to attacks on our military bases. There's myriad examples, of our enemies becoming more aggressive on the international stage, even picking on American troops because they know that, the commander in chief does not mean business. And, that makes America less safe, and it makes the world by extension less safe as well.
I would agree with that. Just, I have no military background, just observationally, it feels as though, where the source of strength in this country is supposed to emanate from the White House. And it feels like there's nothing coming out of there, nothing coming out of there regarding the border, nothing coming out of there regarding these attacks through the Middle East. It's very frustrating. And I just, I wonder if you could talk a little bit, and I hope this isn't too much of a stretch, but when you play for an NFL team, as you did, are there similar sentiments of you have to exude a certain kind of strength in order to win a game, to let your opponents know this is going to be tough?
Absolutely. I'm a big believer in the notion that leadership is not domain dependent. Leadership is still leadership. You and I both have a sports, background, being in the sports world. And then I went from there to the military, and I can just tell you from having a foot in both worlds, leadership is really, at the end of the day, that's what matters. It matters who your head football coach is at the college and professional level. And it matters who your leaders are. You really can't overcome poor leadership. And the flip side of that is that, great leadership, it makes it almost impossible for you not to succeed, whether on the football field or on the battlefield. And that's, that's something that, that's a lesson that I've tried to impart to people, given my experience. I think that a great this might sound a little bit wild, but I think it's 100% true. I think a great football coach at the college or pro level, could very easily be a great military leader, and vice versa. I think a great military leader would be a great football coach at the high school, professional, or collegiate level. And there are examples of this in our history. General Nealon, who was I think a World War I or World War II veteran. He came back and was the head football coach at the University of Tennessee. They named the stadium after him, General Nealon Stadium, right there in Knoxville. So, there are a lot of parallels between those forms of leadership, and that's at the end of the day, that's what matters. That's what you have to cultivate. And really, you're always going to be behind the eight ball if you don't have great leadership at the top.
Right. I couldn't agree with you more. I've sat in so many meetings with coaches. Mike Tomlin could get me to run through a wall. He's got that way about him. I could say that about a number of coaches, but he comes to mind right away as being one of these people that just, you don't think when you're sitting in a room with Mike Tomlin, you don't think there's a question that you could ask him that he will not have the answer to, and it's thought out and it's smart and it's just he's a remarkable guy. I don't know how much time you've ever spent with him, but he comes top of mind to me as a guy who is a leader extraordinaire, but there are many of them, and players as well. I mean, Alejandro Villanueva was in the armed services as well. One of my favorite players. The thing about pro sports that always seems to me to be exemplary is the way that people get along within a team. Now, that's not to say that you won't have bad apples and you won't have, a cancer on a team or a disruptor or that kind of thing. But one of the things Amy Trask, who used to be the general manager of the Raiders, is a friend of mine. And we have agreed on this, that when you go inside a locker room, you don't see race, right? You see teammates. When you're out there playing on the football field, you see teammates. This started to change a little bit with Colin Kaepernick and players wanting to involve themselves in social justice, which I understand. But how would you describe, I'll just throw it out there, race relations in an NFL or a college locker room?
Well, so my NFL career ended before all the Kaepernick business. So I really can't speak to what's happening now or relatively recently, but I can just give you my own experience. Race relations were very good on my college team at the University of Arkansas, and then in my professional team with the New England Patriots. And we were both winning programs. And the old saying is that winning makes up for a lot of ills. And that's certainly true. That was probably an element of it. But, sports, I think, has always had a very special place in our society and our culture because it really represents the best of American values. People of different backgrounds, different races, different creeds, perhaps, coming together to strive towards a common goal. Americans have always prized excellence. We always want to win. We always want to be the best. We always want to dominate. That's why, I love all the American sports championships. They're called world champions, because we see ourselves as the greatest in the world. And that kind of excellence is something that is deep in our national identity. And that's why Americans love sports, and they love to see people compete at the highest level. And that's why I think there's this great connection between the culture of America and college and professional sports teams. And at least when I was there and, at its best, obviously there's going to be problems and there's going to be some, bad apples, one or two, inside the bunch. But, on the whole, everyone, we're always kind of rowing in the same direction. It's a pretty egalitarian culture inside a locker room. People, the real currency, I tell people this all the time, the currency, inside an NFL locker room and a college locker room, the currency is respect. And the way you get that respect is by your performance. It's not by, what your last name is. It's not by your background. It's not by, your draft position or how highly you were recruited. It's about your performance and what you bring to the team. And, the more you perform on the field, the more respect you have and the more respect you earn in that locker room. And, I think that's what's greatest about American culture. Just theoretically, we're not always perfect and this doesn't always manifest itself, particularly not these days, but ultimately, you want to have a society, that is meritocratic, where people are, evaluated based on, their, not just, what their background or, what happened before them, but what they've done, for their businesses, their, families, their communities and their country. And, I think that's why Americans always love sports.
I agree with that. I love watching fans interact. And so often you see fans who've never even met, sitting next to each other at a Super Bowl and their team scores and they're hugging each other and they're high-fiving each other. And it doesn't matter how much money the other guy makes, where they're from, what their last name is. They're cheering for a common, their team. And so it has brought people together. And that's kind of been my fear about what has taken place, because some people have said, how can any of these athletes sort of turn their back on American values when they're playing this game and they're making all this money and they're enjoying this this fame, and this is what they do for a living, and they won't stand for the flag. Now, I think some of that has dissipated, and I hope that's the case. But we saw it. I was covering the NFL when all of this started and when it continued to happen, and we saw a dip in ratings. We saw people saying, I'm not a fan anymore. And it wasn't insignificant. It was important. But I'd like to see that. I'd like to see that part of us heal, because this is where we do come together to celebrate merit, to celebrate greatness. And along those lines, Jake, and I think I know what you're going to say, but I'm going to still ask you, one of the things going on in the world of sports right now that you well are aware of, who isn't, is that women's sports is kind of being encroached upon by transgender women. These are biological men, born men, who have decided, for whatever reason, they want to compete against women. Title IX was passed so that women could have opportunities to experience competition in college and elsewhere, and that they could have teams of their own. And now you're seeing that encroached upon. So while you may be fine, have trans friends, whatever, you support trans people, you may not support this infringement on women's spaces. Everyone's talking about safe spaces for people of this or that identity. What about for women, where they can compete in a fair environment? And I've seen some men speak out about this. Here's your chance. What do you think about all of this?
I think it's the height of insanity. I'm not going to pretend that this is normal. I mean, that to me is what's so bizarre about all this, is that people are trying to pretend, that something like truly insane as a man pretending to be a woman trying to compete in women's sports, that is somehow normal. I'm never going to pretend that is normal. I'm never going to pretend that is acceptable. It's just not. And, you can call me whatever name you want to in the book. I really don't care. There's a meme that's, going around, it's kind of evergreen. My friends and I and my family send it back and forth. I'm not a radical. I'm just a normal person from 20 years ago. That's kind of the way I feel about a lot of things. I'm not just going to go with the flow in this glacial drift of just truly bizarre and insane, policy decisions and cultural changes. That's just, I'm not a father. I don't have any daughters, but I have a lot of friends who are, and, a lot of people who are very invested in female sports. And it's heartbreaking to see, this happen. But, really, in my mind, just to go to the root of it, you have to examine the incentives, that led us to this position. We've redefined so many fundamental things about, our society, what it means to be a man versus a woman, what is a marriage, what is a family. And when you start breaking those things down, it's hard to, put the toothpaste back in the tube, as you said. You can't unring the bell. And all of these things that just, they seem to come out of nowhere. Really, in my mind, these are just the inevitable consequences of these societal changes, these fundamental transformations that have taken place over the years. And until we are willing to go back and re-examine those initial changes, we're still going to see more of this insanity. But just to put a point on it, I'm very much against non-biological women, competing in sports that were designed for only biological women. And I'm not going to pretend that kind of a change is normal.
Well, let's go back to what you just said, fundamental changes. And you're just a guy from 20 years ago. I'm right there with you, man. Some of these fundamental changes, where would you start? And in terms of how did this all begin? I think it's been seeping in and taking root in, cinema, in journalism, in academia for decades now. And they've finally managed to flower some people who really believe all of this stuff is legit and real and the way it's supposed to be. So if we go back to, as you said, the start of these fundamental changes, where would you want to start if you were a U.S. senator or congressman?
I mean, we could do an entire podcast on this. I mean, we're talking about seriously deep conversations here. I mean, really, like just to begin, I mean, you have to revisit, a lot of these Supreme Court decisions that were reached, not just recently, but back in the 70s, 60s, 50s, and even earlier, because a lot of these things were, the intent may have been to correct, systemic, inequalities in our society, but I think what we've seen is that the consequences of those decisions, have made things far worse. I mean, you could, I mean, like, just not to go too deep down the rabbit hole here, but a lot of things have upended our society. I mean, technological changes, have really upended, the fundamental dynamics. There's a lot of upheaval in our culture, as we've gone from, a more, agrarian, agricultural, culture and society where, people didn't really venture that far from their home their entire lives. And it was really easy to have those bonds of community. And now with the revolutions in information technology, you've really enabled people to be a lot more mobile and not really have to have those fundamental connections. It's easier for people, men and women, to be safe. You don't really have to rely upon a men or a small group of men for physical protection. Again, not to go too deep down the rabbit hole, but like we have to start with these. Really these sweeping court decisions that have been made over the past several decades. As the late great Antonin Scalia said, no societal transformation without representation. And I think that is a fundamental truth of what's happened over the past 100 years in America, is that we've had societal transformation mostly by the judicial system, the federal courts. They've taken these 50-50 issues where I believe that people should be able to make those decisions at the state and local level. But the federal bench has made these sweeping pronouncements that have turned 50-50 issues into 100-0 issues. And to me, that's where you have to start. You have to allow these red states, these red communities to do things the way they want, and these blue states and blue communities to do things the way they want.
All right. I like to wrap up all of my interviews with guests and ask for something hopeful, because I don't know about you, Jake, but I have felt a little less than hopeful in the last couple of years. I had hoped that when Joe Biden won, that it might be okay, that everything might be okay. And it has been so much worse than I ever thought possible under his administration. So I'm searching for hope. And obviously we're about to enter 2024, and maybe there's some hope there. But when you look at your experiences, your future, the world, America, where do you find hope right now, Jake?
I find hope in my family, in my faith. We're not meant to be fearful of the future. You can look at things with clear eyes, and understand the challenges that are before us. But as long as I have air in my lungs, I'm going to try to make my small segment of the world a better place. And just things might get worse in the short term, but I'm long term bullish, optimistic on the future. I met so many. I mentioned during the campaign, I met so many great young people in Arkansas and across the country, who believe the things that we believe, who believe the things that great Americans who came before us believed, and they're willing to fight for what they believe in. A lot of our problems are generational. Obviously there's a lot of, not so great things in the youth in America these days, but I will say, just to speak for the young people, there really are some reasons for hope and optimism. And it's going to take time. It's going to take time for us to grow and develop and take our places in leadership in our society and our politics. But I have hope for the future, because there's some great young people out there who are willing to fight for what they believe in, for what we believe in. And they're going to build something great.
I feel like we might be at a tipping point where people are finding their courage again to stand up and say, you know what, you can call me any name that you like. You can label me any way you want, but I know who I am and I know what I'm not. And I know that I'm on the right side of this issue or that issue, and that what you're trying to do by simply calling me a name is shut me up. And it's not going to happen. On that note, Jake, I am so appreciative of your time, and I'd love to do it again. I'm sure I'll run into you along the way somewhere. But he is Jake Bequette. I'm Michele Tafoya. As always, I say this every time: be brave and do good. And we will see you next time. See you, Jake.
Thanks, Michele. Take care.